Recently, I started a semi-unofficial series where I look at various units in depth from a mechanical perspective. Sometimes it's people who I think are underrated, like Micaiah from Radiant Dawn. Sometimes it's people who I think are overrated, like Mercedes from Three Houses. And sometimes it's people who I think are just really weird and interesting, like Tana and Leonardo. I've been having a lot of fun doing it, so I decided to ask my Patreon patrons which unit they want me to take a look at next. And pretty overwhelmingly, they voted for Sue from the Binding Blade. I actually really like Sue. She's one of my favorite units to use because the female Nomad animations are just so sick, and you can't get them with anyone but her. I've seen a couple of people talk about Sue being underrated, both in general and in my specific FE6 tier list, and while I disagreed with this notion, at least going into the video, I thought it was worth investigating. Maybe she is better than I think. I mean, I won't say no to the opportunity to hype up one of my favorite girls. But before we get to the business of hyping her up, I do want to hype up my patrons, by which I mean thank them. So thank you, Storm, Jamie Collins, Marin Karen, Thick Mulder, Danielle Kalaskis, Jagan is an S, Julia Kyoto, Arvis, Belle Wenska, Tailored Muffin, George Grenville the 7th PM, SUP, Caius Cole, Gabe the Green, Control Aegis, Joanna of the Wrench Witch, Juniper Jungbee, Ginger, Dice Lilzabeth, Autumn Kelsey, Gameboo, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Saxon, Seraphew58, Reflect, Robin Cars That Drive, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, and Queen Elzium. Also a last minute thank you to Karosa, who joined after I recorded the previous thank you but before I finished editing the video. If you are interested in supporting the channel financially and gaining access to things such as voting, early videos, and a bunch of other benefits, my link to the Patreon is below, although please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. And without any further ado, let's talk about Sue. Just kidding, there will be a little bit of further ado, because I want to start by talking about the Nomad class. So, I genuinely don't know if this is a hot take or just a commonly accepted opinion, but I believe that the Nomad class is better than the Paladin class in the Binding Blade. Cavaliers have access to swords and lances, and Paladins get the full triangle, but both classes primarily end up using swords in my experience. The weapon triangle in FE6 is relatively weak, only granting 10 hit and avoid and 1 weapon might. However, stats among the physical weapon types are distributed very unevenly. If we take a look at their iron variants, iron swords actually have 15 more hit than iron lances, and 20 more hit than iron axes. This means that if you're facing a lance user and have the option between choosing a sword, which is at weapon triangle disadvantage, and a lance, which is at weapon triangle neutral, the sword is actually more accurate. And perhaps even funnier, you'll have the same accuracy with a sword at weapon triangle disadvantage as you would with an axe at weapon triangle advantage. Now, this is compensated for a little bit with the variance in might. The Iron Sword only has 5 might, Iron Lance has 7, and Iron Axe has 8. But for a variety of factors, hit rates in the Binding Blade are pretty notoriously unreliable. And as a result, in most situations, I would actually prefer the increased accuracy over the slight might increase. After all, enemies are usually bulky and fast enough that you're not particularly close to one-rounding. And speaking of enemy speed, the other advantage swords have over axes and lances is their light weight. If we look at irons again, the iron sword is only 5 weight, whereas the iron lance is 8 weight and the iron axe is 10 weight, a truly laughable number. As you get further down the chain into steals and effective weapons, the difference becomes even more extreme, with things like the hammer versus armor slayer being a cruel joke against axe users. As a result, the extra weapons that Cavaliers and Paladins get don't really feel like a huge benefit. The biggest upside is access to 1-2 range as well as Horse Slayer, Halberd, and Hammer for effective damage. As I mentioned a few seconds ago, the Hammer and Halberd's accuracy is really fucking bad, but they are nice to have for big damage if you need it. A common strategy that I like is Halberd Marcus during Chapter 4 to take care of all of the pesky Cavaliers. 1-2 range, on the other hand, is weird, because it is definitely a useful tool in Paladins' arsenals, allowing them to enemy phase mixed groups of units, but it is also worse than it is in almost any other point in the series. Javelins and hand axes have pretty extreme weight, so it becomes hard to double, and while their accuracy isn't exactly hammer tier, it's still going to land you with that iconic Binding Blade miss sound effect quite often. As such, in many situations, paladins just feel like mercenaries or myrmidons with a horse. But mercenaries and myrmidons are pretty good in the Binding Blade, and giving one a horse just makes them better. So by no means am I calling it a bad class. But Nomad troopers also have swords and horses, but they trade the occasionally useful physical weapon triangle for the much better bow access. I know bows are often memed on in Fire Emblem, especially the GBA games, but in Binding Blade they are legitimately very useful. The game is jam-packed with scary flying enemies, and there are plenty of maps where you can leverage 2-range lock to effectively enemy phase with a bow. Combine that with the fact that, bafflingly, Nomads don't take effective damage from horse-slaying weapons, which I used to think was a bug, but I've been told it actually makes more sense under the Japanese translation, so I think it's intentional, it just skews the balance even further in the favor of Nomads. As a result, Nomad and Nomad Trooper end up being one of the best class lines in the game. It's also worth noting that because Binding Blade doesn't have reclassing, there's no inherent stat gains or losses associated with specific class lines. Yes, FE Builder does do that with some behind-the-scenes stuff that can affect randomizers, but in the vanilla games, there's not a plus X many strength minus X many speed for being a paladin versus a nomad. It's just not a thing that happens. I mean, I personally consider Shin to be a better unit than every non-Marcus paladin, and his class line is a big reason for that. But we're not here to talk about Shin, we're here to talk about Sue. And if Amelia, Kent, and Fiona have taught us anything, it's that being in a good class line can't save you if you are a truly abysmal unit. So let's take a look and see. Is Sue actually useful, or is she coasting on the benefits of Nomad Trooper without adding anything of her own? Sue first joins you in Chapter 6, specifically near the end of Chapter 6. She's in the jail cell in the top left of the map, and the throne is in the center top of the map. I find that unless you go out of your way to recruit her early or grind on some of the optional reinforcements, most of the enemies are dead by the time she shows up, and so she doesn't get that much experience, and is pretty close to, if not exactly at base, when the infamous Chapter 7 starts. And this is relevant because Chapter 7 is often touted as the big showing for our 3 early game bow users. This is the first map to feature Wyverns. In fact, it's the first map to feature any enemies who take effective damage from bows. And the 3 Wyverns here are arguably the scariest enemies on the map, possibly even scariest enemies in the early game. Enemy stats are variable, so these numbers will go up and down by about 1 point, but on average they will have 34 HP, 12 defense, and 11 speed, although effectively they only have 8 AS because they have steel lances that weigh them down by 3. Marcus and Zealot cannot combine to kill one of these Wyverns at base with the silver lances. That is how intimidating they are, and there are 3 of them, and they can fly over a map with a bunch of 1-tile-wide corridors. Because bows deal effective damage and are relatively accurate, sometimes even untrained Walt, Dorothy, and Sue can be justified as deployments in Chapter 7, just to kill some Wyverns. Heck, if you're not planning on using them long-term, killing Wyverns and then sacrificing them is not a bad play. Well, for Walt and Dorothy. Sue, on the other hand, you probably want to keep alive to recruit Shin, but, you know. That being said, I think people sometimes overstate the effectiveness of the base archers against these Wyverns. Sure, they're more effective than a lot of your infantry, but they're still not one-rounding them, not even close. With an iron bow, they typically have around a 75% chance to deal 1/3 of the Wyvern's HP. If you want to pump it up to a half health bar, you could give them a steel bow, but that lowers the chance to around 60%, sometimes even less. Supports could help supplement this to a degree. Walt in particular has a long time to pick up either a fire support with Alan or Roy, potentially even both. And Sue could potentially get a C support with Roy, although that's not going to add as much as the higher ranks would. Because Dorothy has the fire affinity, no matter who she supports, she's going to gain some hit, but she also only has 1 map to build up ranks, and so she will be at most at C rank. It's also like, okay, this is a personal preference, but I find grinding supports in Binding Blade to be really obnoxious. It's technically free because you can just spam end turn at the end of every map, but it's like really annoying to do, so I don't typically like factoring them in. Especially because oftentimes they are factored in unevenly. Like, some people gain supports faster than others, sure, but at the end of the day, if we're just spamming end turn, then most people are likely to get the max supports with the people you want within a semi-reasonable time frame. The exception, of course, is Roy and Lilina's C support, but that's irrelevant to the Sue conversation. In fact, this whole support thing is pretty close to irrelevant to the Wyvern conversation. Really got sidetracked there. My point is that the bow users are quite good against the Wyverns, but I do think their performance is sometimes a little bit overstated. Sue definitely performs best out of all three. Her strength is on par with Dorothy, and she actually has higher speed, although not by enough to allow her to double the Wyverns. But her biggest benefit in Wyvern slaying is her horse, extending her effective attack range by 2 tiles over the foot-mounted archers. Did I just fucking say foot-mounted archers? I couldn't decide whether to say foot-locked or unmounted, and so I just kind of merged them together. I guess technically Dorothy and Walt are mounted on their feet. That's okay, I'm using that. We're keeping this in, by the way. My point is that Sue's Chapter 7 performance, even at base, is gonna be on the upper end of available units. She won't be on the same level as Marcus, Seelit, Rutger, and Deke, but probably better than anyone else I haven't mentioned. The Christmas Cavaliers probably outperform her against standard enemies, so it depends on whether you value that more versus being an effective Wyvern killer. And potentially if you hyper-invested into Lou, he could do something, but his bulk is not great, especially at this point in the game. But Chapter 7 is only one chapter, and just because she performs relatively well in that chapter does not necessarily mean that she's going to be better than the rest of your units during the remainder of the campaign. So let's take a look at her performance beyond Chapter 7. Throughout the midgame, there are a number of maps that are actually really good for a unit with Sue's attributes. Chapters 8, 10B/11A, 12X, 13, and 15 are all very movement-intensive maps, where you appreciate having a horse, although to be fair, the high movement is useful on basically every map. Well, with the exception of Chapter 14, which is a shame because Chapter 14 is a good map to have a bow on, just it's not really enough to justify deploying Sue. However, Chapters 8X, 11A, 12, 13, 14X, and 15 are also all maps that really benefit bow users. In the cases of Chapters 13, 14X, and 15, it's because there are a large number of flyers on it. On the other hand, Chapters 12, 11, and 13 have large groups of archers that you can effectively enemy phase with another bow user. In fact, one of my go-to strategies for taking on Chapter 11A is to use Shanna to drop a couple of units over the wall and fight the archers and axe fighters that are in the top part of the village. On this playthrough, I decided to drop Sue and Shin over there and found that they were actually really good at taking on the enemies because most of them were either using bows or hand axes. So by putting one of our Nomads in the choke point, they could effectively force them to attack at 2 range. I ended up having the Nomads get a C support with each other on the map, but if you really want to, you could support grind prior and improve their performance even better. But since I've mentioned him, I should talk about Shin. Shin is one of the best units in the game, leveraging all of the advantages of the Nomad class while also having very good bases and decent growths to go alongside them. Recruiting Shin and then looking at his stats versus Sue's feels very much like recruiting Percival's and then looking at your Paladin, Allen, or Lance. Only the Christmas Cavaliers have 18 Percival free chapters to contribute and make a good impression, whereas Sue only has 4 chapters before Shin shows up. Of course, you could just hashtag use both. I talked about bows being useful and I talked about horses being useful, but it's worth noting that Sue is neither the only horse unit nor the only bow unit available on the maps where you want to mount or you want bows. During the mid-game stretch, you have up to 4 unpromoted Cavaliers and 2 pre-promoted Paladins. If you want horses, you've got plenty of horses even before factoring in the girl from the plains. Bow units are a little bit tighter. Shin is obviously the best of them, but aside from him, you do end up getting Klein, who is a pretty good pre-promoted sniper. He doesn't have the horse access Sue has, but in most situations his bases will be better than her stats at the time, and his weapon ranks are very good as well, starting with A in bows that Sue is probably not likely to reach by that point. You could theoretically also train Walt and Dorothy, but Sue has better stats and a better class than them, so you're probably not doing that. Now, as the age-old story goes, you could just hashtag use both. On the maps where you want bows, deploy all 3 bow users. On the maps where you want horses, deploy all 8 horses. But even a game like Binding Blade isn't so generous with deployment slots that this feels free. You're probably also deploying Shanna, and Clarine, and maybe another staffer, Roy takes up a slot as well, and with so many horses, you probably want a couple of infantry good at combat since you can ferry them around with rescue drops. I mean, you have the horses to spare. My point is that just because she has desirable traits doesn't automatically earn her a place on the team. She is always going to be a subpar version of Shin, and Shin is a very good unit, but do you actually want a second one of him? In some situations I would say yes, but in others not necessarily. I don't think she's a slam dunk auto-include on your team. She's a fine unit with a lot of really good qualities that ultimately don't come together as much as you would like them to. But if that's all there was to say about Sue, I'm not sure that she would warrant an entire video. So let's look to the dark side. Let's once again turn our eyes to the forbidden art of favoritism. So earlier I said that Sue probably joins a little bit too late on Chapter 6 to level up much on that map, but that's not necessarily true. If you give Roy the available door key and rush towards the prison cell, you can recruit Sue as early as turn 4 or 5. While this is probably too late to kill any of the initial enemies, there are multiple waves of reinforcements you can feed to our girl to give her that yummy experience. Since Chapter 6 is the first map without the glitched double hard mode bonuses, it is often seen as a good opportunity to train up your weaker units, and I usually use it to feed some experience to Shauna. But in my most recent playthrough, I decided to try splitting that experience evenly between Sue and Shauna. The goal is to get Sue to 12 speed so she can double the Wyverns with an iron bow. This requires 4 speed procs on a 65% growth, so about 6 or 7 levels. This is a pretty tall order, but thankfully Sue does start at level 1, so she'll gain experience faster than the rest of your crew. Make no mistake, however, this is favoritism. We are heavily investing into Sue in order to get a short-term payoff. Now, this isn't the only Binding Blade strategy that invests in a unit for short-term payoff. One of the more commonly known ones is training Marcus's axe rank so that he can use the halberd on Chapter 4. I've heard the argument that this isn't as much investment in Marcus as you would think, since he just needs to use axes, he doesn't need to kill people, but if Marcus is using an axe against soldiers in Chapter 3, he's killing them. The main difference between investing in Sue in Chapter 6 and investing in Marcus in Chapter 3 is that Marcus kind of naturally gets some amount of investment because he's the best unit to take on a lot of combat situations in Chapter 3. Whereas Sue is really not the best unit for any combat situation on her join map. If you are giving her experience, you are actively going out of your way to do so. So the question becomes, is this worth it? In a playthrough that cares about turn count, probably not. Even if we're fighting the waves of reinforcements near the throne room, giving Sue enough kills to reach level 7 or 8 either requires slowing down and leaving units alive for Sue to kill on player phase, or going out of your way to get some of the reinforcements from the bottom 2 rooms. In my playthrough, I opted for the later, and while I did only need the reinforcements from the bottom left room as opposed to both bottom left and bottom right, it was still a tax on my turn count. I think if we're using Chapter 6 to try to train up one of our scrubs, then we've basically accepted that we don't care about the turn count, at least on that map. So the question becomes, does giving this experience to Sue have more of a payoff than giving this experience to one of our other units? And I would argue yes. While I recognize that the argument just give them experience could be applied to any number of bad units, such as Awakening Donal or Engage Anna, feeding all of that experience to Sue gives you something truly unique, at least in the short term. I already prefer her in Chapter 7 for taking on the Wyverns due to her horse, and her high speed growth and base means that she's the only one who can reasonably get to the point where she's doubling them. Doubling the Wyverns with the Iron Bow will deal about 2/3 of their HP to them. This is the largest chunk of damage a single unit can do. Well, outside of things like a killer axe crit on a plus speed C rank axe's Marcus. And it's not like this investment only applies to Chapter 7. Chapter 8 is already a map where you want a lot of horses, and there's multiple groups of archers that she can effectively enemy phase with her bows. Earlier I mentioned her ability to be a good filler unit in the mid-game, but I think if you invest in her early, she ends up being even better. By the time I recruited Shin, they had comparable stats to each other, albeit she was a higher level, so he did eclipse her once I gave him some training. But even then, Sue was able to contribute. There's 2 Orion's bolts that you get fairly early on, and Shin and Sue are basically uncontested for them. I mean, Wolt and Dorothy aren't especially good investment units, and the 2 snipers don't need them because, well, they're already promoted. Shauna also didn't suffer from the missed Chapter 6 experience. She still hit level 12 on time for the first Elysian Whip, and Killer Lance, Silver Lance, and Iron Sword are able to carry her through the Western Isles regardless of her stats. As such, the experience and promotion of Sue both feel pretty free. Well, there is one cost I've been neglecting to mention this whole time, and that's the route split. For those who are unaware, FE6 features 2 route splits, but the one in question is the Ilya Sakai one. It compares the amount of experience you gave the 2 Nomads, Sue and Shin, to the experience you gave the 2 Pegasus riders, Tate and Shauna. If you give more to the Pegs, you go to Ilya, and if you gave more to the Nomads, you go to Sakai. Most people consider Sakai to be harder and more frustrating and just generally desirable to avoid, and I would agree with most people. I fucking hate Sakai. Although I do think that people referring to Ilya as the good route is a bit too generous to those dogshit snow maps. Honestly, if I could pull a Revelations and refuse to pick a side, I absolutely would. But Sakai has quite a few annoying aspects. There's the notorious avoid tank Gel the Swordmaster, a Gaiden map with 6 thrones that you need to seize, and randomly one of them is correct, but the other 5 are just ambush spawn traps. Annoying fog ballistas, although to be fair, these are also present in Ilya, and a plethora of dangerous nomads. Also, Nime, the number 1 Gilf, shows up one map later without any sort of buff to compensate, so this is a little bit annoying too. The only arguable upside is that Dayan, the Sakai exclusive unit, is significantly better than Juno, the Ilya exclusive unit, but it's not like Dayan is some sort of super unit. He's pretty middling. Sure, he can pretty easily kill Wyverns with the Silver and Brave bows, but if you've trained both Sue and Shin and have the Regalia available, then there's no shortage of Wyvern killers. My point with all of this is that going to Sakai is pretty undesirable. And the more you use Sue, the more likely you are to go to Sakai, especially if you use the Chapter 6 favoritism strategy. But do we penalize Sue for this? Well, that's a bit of a complicated question, at least in my opinion. When evaluating units, I personally penalize for recruitment or usage costs. So, for example, Hugh is punished for the fact that he costs 5,000 gold, and Barth, Bors, and Wendy are punished for the fact that they are stealing a promotion item from a Cavalier. However, in each of these cases, the cost is concrete. You're either losing money or a specific item. In Sue's case, going to Sakai is a much more subjective cost. Not only because you can't quantify it with a monetary value, but also because there's probably some people who prefer Sakai to Ilya. I mean, there are people who think Fire Emblem 7 is a good video game, so there's definitely a wide possibility of opinions in this world. As a result, I think I come down on the side of not penalizing Sue for sending us to Sakai, but I honestly wouldn't blame anyone who thinks that we should. In my personal opinion, going to Sakai is an undesirable outcome, and I'd be lying if I said there were not playthroughs where I benched Sue just so I didn't have to hang out with Gel and Monkey. With all of that being said, I should probably address the question in this video's title and thumbnail. Is Sue underrated? If I pull up the FE6 tier list that I made earlier this year, I put Sue in C tier. My logic was that she is a good fiddler unit mostly due to the strength of her class line, but you won't miss her if you end up benching her. After taking a look at Sue and examining the Chapter 6 favoritism strategy, I do think that she deserves to be in low B tier rather than high C. I feel that this early investment of experience causes her to be both great short-term and decent long-term. Although it is worth noting that I do not personally factor in turn counts when it comes to my unit evaluations, and if you are doing a turn-oriented playthrough, Sue probably still belongs in C tier. The Chapter 6 strategy does cost quite a few turns, even if you're going for all of the treasure chests. But what are your thoughts about the best bow girl in FE6? Do you think I'm being too harsh on her? Do you think I'm being too lenient? Would you put her somewhere entirely different than me? Have you ever tried the Chapter 6 favoritism strategy? I'm curious to hear your comments down below. But regardless of whether you agree or disagree about Sue's viability, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.